their stuff going, so we need to pray for them as well, right?
That's right. But they may be watching, so Angie and Bert, if you're watching, welcome. Well, we've come to the end of our little road with Howard Thurman and Jesus and the Disinherited. And we've looked at these chapters, 5 weeks, one chapter at a time, with this idea of how does Jesus, the person of the traditions around Jesus, how do they speak to issues that confront the oppressed, the underrepresented, the disinherited? And all these weeks I've been thinking about that word, disinherited, and its correlation to, being not only disowned, but not even owned in the first place, not even someone's possession, just being outside of love, which is today's chapter. And how he moves through the hounds of hell, those things that grab at us to keep us angry and mean and wanting to cast stones, a text to look at in this chapter, against those who are different than us. And just so many of the barriers, labels, and walls that we put up, Jesus wishes to take down. And the best of religious traditions try and do that. And scrub away the pretense and remove away all of the stuff that keep us away from me looking at you and you seeing me as another human being. And that's it. The best of our religious traditions, whatever they are, and I'm not just talking Protestant or Christian, but any and all, get at that. Human dignity, integrity, and respect, and love. To get to this, though, notice he puts love the last chapter. He doesn't, he doesn't start with that. He moves through what are the things that keep us away from this: fear, deception, hatred. So last week we looked at we looked at hatred last week. That sounds strange to say, isn't it? Looked at it. I saw it all week. You have to realize that in this journey, pilgrimage of life, it's one thing to say, here's fear, deception, hypocrisy, hatred, and it's another thing to see fear, hatred, and hypocrisy in me, which is the sermon today. So I won't preach it. I won't preach it now. But in systems of relationships that have a power, structure, the oppressed and the oppressor, the superior and inferior dynamic really rests on those three. That if I can make you afraid of me, if I can be deceiving, and if I can learn to hate you and not see you as a person, I am liable to keep that same tension in the relationship. That, in other words, I will be very present to my superiority if I can make you fear me, if I can make you be less than you are, not who you are, and if I can hate you. So remember from a couple of weeks ago, he said, last week, that hatred can move along the lines of acquaintance without fellowship. That I don't have to get to know you. I can just think I know you, and that should be good enough. Or I can keep you so way over here that to hate you is not all that difficult. And we talked last week about all of the types of folks, all of the conditions, all the circumstances that allow us to do that all the time. Even liberal progressives. hate it when we have to look at ourselves. And that's what makes this call to this kind of life so difficult. I think when we're really honest about this, that's when we can, I'm the world's worst of this, of taking a caricature of something and blowing it up in such a way as to, not just belittle, but demean. Conservatives and fundamentalists aren't the only ones who do that. We do it too. I do it.
Well, it's hard.
Well, it is.
Because at one point I was working as a docent, and there was in a house museum outside of DC, and there was a woman whose husband had former Navy, and so they have TRICARE. He's retired. They have this health system that takes care of them.
Right.
And during the Obama administration, when they were trying to pass Obamacare, we would have these discussions. But I couldn't have any discussion with her because everything I said, so how then do you, it's really hard
Yes.
to have any, if somebody doesn't want to listen to you and their way is, anyway, so
Yeah.
it is very difficult.
Welcome to my job, Jan. No, you're absolutely right, and that just fuels the antagonism within ourselves towards. Well,
Yes.
and again, I won't preach today's sermon. Don't get me going, Jessica.
I didn't mean to, but
No, you're right.
very
You're right.
difficult.
Yes.
And
Very.
when people say, well, we just have to talk to them, and I go, that's nice,
Right.
but they have to be willing to talk back to us
Right.
And to listen.
and to listen.
Yeah.
And I've gotten so that with a whole host of friends in Texas, I don't want to know what their politics are. I don't want to know.
Mm.
Keep it to yourselves, because I don't want to change my opinion of you based on all the things that are going on. I just like to know.
The only issue with that is you're likely to sort of see their politics rather than them saying it out loud.
If you have more closer contact,
Right.
maybe it's all through Facebook, or please don't post political stuff on your Facebook
Right.
page.
Right.
Just, chill.
Yes, that's right.
Part of the thing is that, though, an avenue is that people are complex, and they are more than the issue that is burning up in us at the time. I have a new job, and one of the things I do is, because I'm the accountant, I deal with all the mail, and my boss, all his mail comes there as well, and it lays out the entire right-wing agenda right in his mail. Right? So, you then try and convince him again. Now, you deal with the things with that person, there's more to that person than that.
Yes.
And you can have discussions on the edge. You can
Yes.
have situations that come up that can, that are don't have to be like this. They can be like this. And then you may be able to have a discussion, but you can't have the discussion unless, and you're fortunate, you have friends, that you want to deal with. So you have that connection already. And so instead of this, it's, here's one that,
Yes.
maybe we can look at, this way.
That's right. How about those Tar Heels? That's where we go, right? Because we think that could be a safe, no, not from you, Mr. Duke. One last thing before we jump into this chapter is that, Jan, while you were talking, I thought about this. So many times when I hear people say something like, I just want to be heard. No, you want to be agreed with. And if I don't agree with you, then you'll just keep saying, all I want is to be heard. But not everything I run up the flagpole, people are going to salute. Because not everything you run up will I salute. Anyway, it's that complicatedness and the complexity, David, that you just named. And I really liked that, the way you framed that. That was very good. So what does the religion of Jesus, this has been his number one thesis, what does the religion of Jesus have to say to the folks who have their backs against the wall? And in his context, he's talking about African Americans. But we have been able to extrapolate from that all kinds of groups, all kinds of folks who have had their backs against the wall as a disinherited, oppressed people. And we don't have to name them all as we have all these weeks, but you know who they are. It's pretty obvious. Did I tell you this story last week? I learned of a situation where a group of liberal Baptists, and friends, there are such people.
Both of them?
That felt like they were really advanced in the attack on racism. Did I tell you all this?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, if I did, just So they were talking about a pastor that they had kind of thought about calling, and feared that this pastor was not as far along as they were. This is an all-white church. This pastor has worked with Native Americans on the plains for decades, doing work that not many white Christian clergy would even anticipate doing in understanding the Native American experience. But this group of church leaders were worried that they weren't as advanced as they were, which sounded awfully racist to me. Such is the deception of our own advancement and superiority. So, love. The religion of Jesus makes the love ethic central, even and especially to the folks with their backs against the wall. Now, of course, that sentence right there that begins this chapter, that will have a lot of pushback from the oppressed, won't it?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it may, look and sound innocuous, but it's pretty controversial.
Because in a sense, it seems to me that requires them, on one level, to forgive the people that have oppressed them in the past. And I don't see much of that. Again, another story, when related to my docenting time, there was a black woman who was working as a washerwoman at another one of the historic house museums in the area. And her daughter complained to her about doing that work. So she was pretending as her job to be a slave and being the person who did the wash. And her response to her daughter was, I am giving voice to the people who can't. The same thing when Colonial Williamsburg wanted to actually demonstrate slave auctions, and the black community went through the roof. If you want the whites to understand slavery in its entirety, in its degradation, all of that, you have to be able to educate them. And that's all they were trying to do. And again, those people were giving voice to people who couldn't at the time. So much of what's going on is exactly that. I don't know exactly what critical race theory is, but that's an education.
Yeah.
And he gets to it in here, and of course, the Good Samaritan story, which he brings in,
Yes, right.
is the classic story.
Yes.
Is that we can deal with groups. If we can put you into a group,
Yes.
we can deal with you as a group. Now, where the real problem comes, as in the Good Samaritan, is when we get it down to mano y mano. That's right. And coming to know people one-on-one. And I'll get off track here for a moment, but I read this week that the NFL has finally acknowledged that in its compensation program to the players for concussions, the NFL determined that blacks have a less cognitive ability than whites, and therefore their compensation is less than to the white football players. And so we have a major business entity in the United States that has made this decision. At the same time, we have millions of people in the United States who have dug in their heels about any education of the history of racism, to how is it that we got to this decision that black football players are entitled to less compensation for concussions than whites because they don't have the same cognitive abilities that whites have. Reading that just blew me away, that the NFL has finally acknowledged that they've made that conscious business decision.
Yeah.
So.
Well, critical race theory, Marsha Blackburn, senator from Tennessee, District Tennessee, said, she doesn't want critical race theory taught in the Tennessee public schools. What she's basically saying is, I don't want history taught in the Tennessee public schools, because that's in many ways what we're talking about here.
Again, this whole education thing, which state controls, to some extent, and I think in history it is more critical than others, because of the volume of books they buy, the content of the books. So if you get your history book, you're not, American history will say, you're not, because that state, being Texas, controls a lot of the input, because they buy more books than anybody else, you're not going to get critical race theory.
Now you've gone from preaching to meddling now, Jan.
Well,
you know I'm kidding. Yeah, don't even get me started on the Texas Board of Education. As a native Texan,
that we don't want to know.
We don't want to. Boy, that's it. Yeah, Jessica.
I was just going to say, of reading this chapter, I was holding also the balance of the forgiveness piece. Whereas, on one hand, frankly, we haven't earned forgiveness yet.
Yes.
As a nation, we are far from that. But also, I hear Thurman from the frame point of the way someone with an abusive parent or finding inner peace, seeking forgiveness in your own inner work, so that you can be free. So we are far from we have not done what we need to do as a nation for forgiveness, but I understand what he is saying about the disinherited, finding somehow, some way for self-preservation and freedom.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that really parallels his own story, doesn't it? I mean, he finds that. Tim?
Well, I didn't get to read this chapter. However, I think he hit upon some of the key points in hate. The chapter on hate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When he talked about the fact that forgiveness, which is a piece for me, is that until we are accountable, till we really, my mother used to grab me by the ear and take me wherever she wanted me to go when I was a little boy. And
That explains the difference.
yeah, exactly. So, and I had to listen to what the lesson was, whether it was nice or not, mostly not, but becoming accountable and we've got to learn to do it in a way, that we're not ready to hear.
Right. Yeah.
But then moving into forgiveness, and that's a hard arena to stay, to even watch, much less to be in.
Well, and he says here that, and now let's dig in really as much as we can in the remaining moments. The idea that in order to fully understand love, in addition to all the previous chapters, it's the role of the enemy. And he says there are at least 3 levels of enemy status. One is the person, family, loved one who has wronged you or has done something to alienate you. And we're very aware of how, even in a split second, with those that we love the most, we can quickly turn them into an enemy based on what they've done. But that's also the space where reconciliation doesn't seem like a pipe dream. That because you love them and you know that they love you, that is a route. The route of reconciliation is something you can get into. The second enemy is less so. This is on page 83 in my book. Comprises those persons who by their activities make it difficult for the group to live without shame and humiliation. Those who profit from your own shame and humiliation. Your example's a great one. And look who they are. They were despised, they were outcast, because from the inside they had unlocked the door to the enemy. To be required to love such a person was the final insult for the oppressed, back against the wall person. To then say, well, you need to love them, is to be an insult, because why would I want and need to love a group, a person, a system that profits from my shame and humiliation? When Jesus became a friend to the tax collectors and secured one as his intimate companion, it was a spiritual triumph of such staggering proportions that after 1900 years, it defies rational explanation. All of 84, all underprivileged people have to deal with this kind of enemy. To love them means, bottom of 84, to love them means to recognize some deep respect and reverence for their persons, but to love them does not mean to condone their way of life.
Wow. How is that even possible?
Read that again.
To love them, the enemy that profits from our shame and humiliation, to love them means to recognize some deep respect and reverence for their persons. But to love them does not mean to condone their way of life. Yeah, that's two elements to that one sentence. One, I have to look past your actions to see you as someone created in the image of God. That's tough to do. That's tough to do with our friends, much less our enemies. And then to take it to an understanding of, I can love them even if I disagree with what they're doing. And boy, are we having a tough time with that one right now. For very legitimate reasons, we're having a tough time with it.
Well, and not only for friends, but for your kids.
Yes.
I love you, I don't love what you just did.
That's right. That's right. Yes. Yeah. Were you hearing my conversation with my son this morning? Yes. Top of 85. We're talking about Matthew. This man is not just a tax collector. He is a son of God. Awaken that awareness in him, and he will attack his betrayal as only he can from the inside. Now, you talk about evangelism. That's evangelism. Mm-hmm. When you teach and preach or embody a way of life that invites your enemy or anyone to then look deep into who they are as a created child of God, that then really can awaken, I like his use of that word, love your enemies, do good to them which hate you, which Walter Wink says that is the subversive way of the disciple of Jesus. That it's a trick almost. Now, you don't set out to be a trickster. It's just that has the effect of turning everything on its head and making you not the oppressed, but the conduit for someone to be thinking differently. And the third enemy is Rome. And Rome is not just Rome. Rome is what?
Power structure.
Huh?
The power structure.
All power structures. It doesn't matter if it's Rome, if it's the Southern Baptist Convention. Sorry, whatever it is that represents a power structure. And how do you love power structures? If Mitt Romney was right that corporations are people too, remember when he said that? Amen. Then how do you love power structures?
In your boat sitting on the lake Sunday morning.
This is on page 85. The third type of enemy was exemplified by Rome. The elements at work here were personal and impersonal, religious and political. To deal with Rome as a moral enemy required a spiritual recognition of the relationship with the empire. Does Jesus have much to say about the empire?
Give to it what it belongs to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
The empire, whether it is Rome or little empires in our lives, are those things I think that, as he says, have both political and religious. That's why, let's not talk politics or let's not talk religion.
It's everywhere.
Yeah, you can't help it. Even when you steer the topic to the Tar Heels, it's still going to come back.
Something good.
Huh?
Just something good.
And 86, let's get to that story of the Good Samaritan. I'm sorry, page 87. Love of the enemy means that a fundamental attack must first be made on the enemy's status. How can this be done? Does it mean merely ignoring the fact that he belongs to the enemy class? Hardly. For lack of a better term, an unscrambling process is required. Now remember, Dr. King carried a copy of this with him everywhere he went. He always had a copy of this book with him. So he was always having to do this unscrambling process. This is asking a lot of us, isn't it? Asking a lot of them.
It's way above and beyond the call.
Obviously, a situation has to be set up in which it is possible for primary contacts to be multiplied. By this, I do not mean contacts that are determined by status or social distinction. There are always primary contacts between the weak and the strong, the privileged and underprivileged, but they are generally contacts without zones of agreement which leave the status of the individual intact. There is great intimacy between whites and Negroes, but it is usually between servant and served, employer-employee. Once the status of each is frozen or fixed, contacts are merely truces between enemies, a kind of armistice for purposes of economic security. What a powerful part of that paragraph. If you've seen, what was that Oprah Winfrey movie about, was it The Butler?
Yeah.
Was that the name of the book?
Yeah.
Okay. That powerfully demonstrates what he has written, The Butler who served all these presidents in the White House. In a very tragic sense, the fate of the relationship seems to be within the hands of the wider social context, and if it remains in the hands of the larger social contract, what happens?
The structure stays the same.
It's not transformed. And that's where we go with the rest of the book, and that is, of course, that love is the great transformer. And love is the only way, and not a sappy Hallmark, sugar and, saccharine sweet love, but a different kind of love that really does strip bare all of the veneer, political, religious, spiritual, economic, strips away all of those veneers and says, I'm beating a dead horse here. You're a human being. And that's enough for us to be brother and sister.
So difficult and yet so simple.
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, again, it goes back to the whole golden rule.
Right.
In essence, if you treat everybody that you meet the way you would like to be treated yourself, that's all you have to do.
Right.
I mean, because you'll see them differently.
Right. The problem, of course, is that we're all born and reared in all these systems that keep us not only away from each other, but they keep us away from our true self. And sometimes, often, religion is the number one thing that keeps us away from acknowledging ourself, our true self. Not just not acknowledging you and your traditions as sacred and holy and good, but I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it? And religion often cripples that process of integration.
Well, and it's only getting worse.
Yeah.
I mean, and again, my background is Presbyterian, and just watch the Presbyterian. At one point, there were two, the North and the South, and they came back together again. And now you keep seeing more and more and more and more divisions within the Presbyterian Church over who knows what.
Oh, I think we know.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, it was really disturbing to me. Does this sound on two levels. One, the church that we belong to in Houston, when I was a kid, joined one of the more conservative ones over the issue of gay priests or pastors. Okay? That disturbed me. And then I go back to Pittsburgh to the church where my parents were married and I was baptized to find it's an evangelical Presbyterian church. So one that had been in existence for a long, long, long time, all of a sudden, and it just the idea disturbs me because I keep thinking, why are we stressing those things that keep us apart as a, whether it's a, I mean, there's enough that the Christian church, Protestants are divided into denominations. Why do the denominations keep dividing? We should be focusing on what brings us together as opposed to all these little idiotic issues. Well, they're not idiotic issues, but you know what I mean.
Well, that's identity, not just politics, that's identity theology, right? That,
yeah.
That, you know, I'm going to be defined by who I keep out more than defined by who I associate with and welcome and all of that. So, you know, you mentioned that at one time there was a North and a South. So C.C. Goyne, a historian, wrote a book 20 years ago called Broken Churches, Broken Nation. And he says that in 1845, 15 years before the start of the Civil War, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Baptists, which had been one, there had just been, if you were a Baptist, you were a Baptist. If you were a Presbyterian, they break, North and South, over the issue of slavery, not states' rights, but slavery. And in time, like you said, the Presbyterians and Methodists, North and South, made up and became one again. The Baptists never did, and they never are. And North and South. And I think what C.C. Goyne says really in this book is that's a marker for us. That is a predictor for us. That before a break, look at what the churches, you know, Dr. King used to say that the churches reflect the culture rather than, you know. In 1845, the country was broken. Yeah. And it was seen so in the churches. So was it a surprise? Not really. When Hitler, and I know just naming that is, you know, tricky, but when Adolf Hitler emerged, it was really no surprise, given the economic and political landscape of the day. What was surprising is that when someone like Hitler emerged, there were so many people waiting for him. Now you do with that what you need to. What is it about folks who, if, as Thurman says last week, prejudice and hatred can come out into the open, and I can take my tiki torch and walk through Charlottesville unhooded, unmasked, it legitimizes it. When someone gives you permission to hate, the sad thing is that there are so many people who are willing to just go along and hate. And so in 1944, when he wrote this could be 2021.
Absolutely.
So, which allows me to
Certainly
say...
2016.
Huh?
Certainly 2016.
Oh, yeah. So I do want to get this in before we have to go. Oh my goodness, you got to go. Bye, audience. This book by Paul Harvey. If you want to know more about Thurman, this one is very good. Paul Harvey, not the Paul Harvey, another Paul Harvey. A religious biography. Thurman, the Disinherited. This is so readable. and just outstanding. I can't say enough